Hello, everyone. Let's get right on into it, shall we? This is a Step 262 final, and I did mine on the disability rights movement of the 1970s. For my introduction and placement, as you all know, I'm Chris Miller. I'm Step 262, and I am a history secondary education major. This semester, I was placed with Mr. Thomas Nelson's middle school social studies classes at Heath Middle School Online, where I observed 6th, 7th, and 8th grade social studies classes. Anything from political science to geography to economics, a lot of variety this semester. The mission statement that I have at the moment, anyways, is that I want students in my class to be able to draw connections from the past to help understand our present and to hypothesize about our future. All students in my class will have the freedom and the safety to explore differing viewpoints and opinions and will hopefully develop an appreciation for the differences we humans bring to the table every single day. My learning outcomes for this presentation are that students will be able to explain how the disability rights movement started and what legislative successes the movement attained for the civil rights of disabled persons. Students will be able to identify factors in the disability rights movement that were similar and different to the civil rights movement of the previous decade. And students will construct an argument on what form of protest they believe culminates in the best results for change. And so I would start off this presentation with good old-fashioned background lecture. So we would start off going in talking about, just a side note, I'm sorry you're going to see a lot in this presentation, a lot of text. I assure you that is not how I build PowerPoints for teaching high school students. I just want to let you all know what I'm going over. So the lecture starts off with talking about how disabled individuals in the early 1970s, looking back on the 1960s, saw how a marginalized community, of course, the black community of America, was able to solidify their civil rights in legislation, and they did so by utilizing the protest. And so in the early 1970s, disabled persons start collaborating with each other, organizing, and lobbying to Congress for legislation. In 1973, we get the Rehabilitation Act. While this did a little bit for disabled persons, like expanding vocational work programs, it hardly did anything else. What the disabled activists were more concerned about was getting Section 504 signed and passed within the 1973 Rehab Act. And in education, we are typically quite familiar with Section 504. If you never knew, this is where it comes from, the Rehab Act of 1973. And so what Section 504 in the Rehab Act of 1973 would do, it would make it so that any entity receiving federal dollars would be completely accessible to disabled persons. However, despite that it was written in 1973, that part of the bill was not signed into law until 1977. The Gerald Ford administration simply would not sign it, thus disability activists had to wait around for Jimmy Carter to sign it into law. So here we get into the language of the 504. I've taken the most important tidbit and put it on the screen for me and my students to walk through together. As I typically try to do when using textual sources, always try to include a translated source for your possible Spanish-speaking CLD, ESL, ELL learners in the classroom. By doing so, you allow them to participate and follow along and have a sense about what you're talking about, right? So once we get one thing. When I analyze textual sources in class, I always read it aloud. So that is a way to differentiate from my more auditory learners who get kind of, too focused on reading the text and not comprehending it correctly. So, I always try to read things aloud so they can just focus on my voice and absorb the information that way. After we get through that bit, and like I try to do on lessons, PowerPoints that I create for lessons, I always try to inundate them with guiding questions. So at the very bottom, once we get through this little section, I would ask my class, prior to this law, what aspects of public life would the disabled not have had access to? Think about what services and institutions are federally funded. This is a brainstorming activity for students to try and think about all of these, federal institutions, federal services that would not have been obligated to serve the disabled community prior to 1977. And here I get into how disability rights movement protesters utilize their right to protest. We focus on the 504 sit-ins of April 1977. While there were numerous sit-ins in cities across the country in 1977, we focus on the San Francisco sit-in because it obviously got the most media coverage and there's some more source material for it. And we go through this information, a little fun fact there that you can read if you want to. And then we're going to watch a little YouTube clip from an 18-minute documentary on the San Francisco sit-in. And that video shows like how the disabled protesters organized, the messages they espoused, and how they framed their desires for civil rights in the same frame that Black civil rights protesters did in the 1960s. Right, and so we will get through that section. I asked my class another question: how do the disability rights protests compare with the civil rights protests we covered in previous lessons? You know, obviously this would come after covering the civil rights movements of the 1960s, so I'm trying to draw those connections back to previous lessons. What were their tactics? How did disability rights protesters frame their message? Things like that. And that will help students when we get to the exit ticket at the end. Right here, we end out the lecture part with, these successes. President Carter signs the 504, of course, in 1977. And from that moment on, anyone or anything receiving federal dollars must be accessible to the disabled. However, these stipulations do not apply to the private sector, of course. That comes with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, signed by George H.W. Bush. And this is my exit ticket. Sorry about that. For 15 minutes, compose an argument behind what types of protests, either peaceful disobedience or violent disobedience, culminate in more or better successes for protesters. Use insights from previous Black civil rights lesson to help support your answer. You may either write an argumentative paragraph or draw a comic. I apologize for the typo on this slide. But what this exit ticket is supposed to get them to do is to develop an argument around, whether peaceful disobedience or violent disobedience is kind of like the better avenue to go. It's an extremely relevant topic, especially with what we've seen in the news this past year. I just want to reiterate, I am not trying to change hearts and minds. I'm trying to get students to consider the different variables that cause people to do certain things. And I think there's a lot to consider. Peaceful disobedience protests are able to frame their movements in a more ethical sense. However, the changes that they are able to attain through that method of protest typically take longer, as opposed to violent disobedience protests, which typically culminate in faster change, right? And I think those are important concepts for my students to consider. I'm not trying to change hearts and minds. I'm trying to get people to think, right? And so one of the ways I differentiate this exit ticket at the end for more kinesthetic learners is they either have a choice of a paragraph to write an argumentative paragraph or draw a comic that details their argument. So by giving them a little bit of variety in what they can do, you help differentiate for how students are able to express the knowledge that they do have, which is always a good idea in whatever teaching setting you're ever doing. So thank you all for listening to this lesson. I know it's a little bit over, but have a great day.